Hello, everyone, and happy Italian American Heritage Month. My name is Mariana Gatto. I'm the director and co-founder of the Italian American Museum of Los Angeles. A special thanks to the IAMLA members who are joining us this evening. Your support helps make programs such as this possible. Another warm welcome to the members of the Italian Sons and Daughters of America. We thank the ISDA for its support in promoting this program. Researching family history can be a daunting process. It can also be an extraordinary experience. Delving into our origins can help us solve family riddles and put us in touch with something much larger than ourselves. This webinar is designed for those of you who are seeking to discover where your ancestors came from and gain insight about your family's early years in the United States. Whether you're considering pursuing dual citizenship, are curious about your origins, or wish to preserve this history before it's lost to time, we're going to explore the basics of conducting genealogical research and provide various tips for embarking on this process. Excuse me. We'll discuss the free and subscription-based websites that make researching family history easier than ever, especially now that many of us have extra time on our hands at home. We'll cover how to interpret or decode some of the historic documents that you're likely to find. We'll discuss how to avoid common mistakes. And finally, we'll explore how to uncover information in the old country. It's a lot of material, so you'll want a pen and paper to take notes. We've received many wonderful questions from you, our audience, and have incorporated the answers to many of those questions into the webinar itself. We'll also be answering some of the other questions towards the end of the program, so stay tuned. Lastly, for those of you who are not of Italian ancestry, although you'll hear the word Italy and Italians referenced quite a bit in this webinar, much of what we're covering tonight is relevant to discovering your family's story, regardless of where your family traces its origins. So let's get started. The IAMLA receives inquiries constantly from families who are seeking to uncover information about their heritage. One of the common denominators among these families is not knowing where to start. The best way to begin is by creating a list of information that you do know. This would include relatives' names, approximate dates of birth, when they were married, when they passed away, places they might have lived, and other bits of information. Whether you're going to be doing the research yourself or whether you end up hiring a professional, starting out in an organized manner is critical. It will help you sort the information that you find with greater accuracy and more effectively. And as this presentation continues, that is, you'll see just how important this step is. Many people start the family history research process with the assumption that they know nothing about their families. Oftentimes, this is really not the case. When prodded, it turns out that you do in fact know a fair amount. So spend some time thinking about what was shared with you. Maybe your father told you that his grandmother had a sister named Immacolata, who people referred to as Ima, or that his grandfather was a barber. Here's a little example. These are the kinds of details that will prove useful as you are researching and piecing together your family history. So again, just jot down what you do know, and we'll continue to discuss that in just a sec. So write down, as I mentioned, the bits and pieces of your family history, even if the information is not confirmed to be accurate. When I'm researching family histories, I'll record what is known for certain in one color, ink, or font, and what has to be verified in another, or I'll place a question mark next to this information, as you can kind of see on this slide. Using a pedigree chart like this, which you can easily find online, start recording the names of your ancestors that you know, beginning with yourself and moving backwards, generation by generation. If you don't know their full names, note their nicknames or the names that you have. When you're recording the names of female relatives, always list them under their maiden names. Using maiden names in family trees ensures that women remain connected to their birth families and maintains consistency in your tree among women who never married, women who might have married once, or those who married more than once. If you don't know a woman's maiden name, simply leave her last name blank. Another organizational technique that you'll find very helpful is assembling a timeline. A timeline will place key events in chronological order, but it will also provide perspective as to what was taking place in the world and where your ancestor might have been in his or her life during key moments of history. The way in which an ancestor experienced a world war, for instance, would be different depending on whether he or she was a baby or whether he was of draft age, for instance. You would record things such as your ancestors' arrival dates, births, marriages, deaths, residences, employment, and other facts, kind of what we were discussing on the first document. Laying out the facts and the dates can help draw correlations and assemble a clearer portrait of your family's lives. Again, how old was grandma when she had her first child? If you notice, for instance, that several of your relatives who were relatively young died in 1918, you might suspect that the Spanish flu or the influenza pandemic was the culprit. This organizational technique is something that I begin constructing as my research starts, and then I continue adding to it as we're going along. Okay, next step. And while this seems, while this may seem fairly obvious, in many cases, our family members hold important keys to uncovering our history. So before looking elsewhere, start with your relatives, speak with your relatives. Now is a great time to pick up the phone or initiate a FaceTime call with your parents, your grandparents, or other family elders. Many times, especially now, our family members are, more likely to be experiencing some of the loneliness that's inherent to quarantine, and they're likely to welcome having that contact with you, and speaking with them will do both of you quite a bit of good. When interviewing family members, it's often useful to prepare a list of questions in advance of making the call, and of course have paper handy in order to take notes. Now, many of us no longer have the luxury of being able to pick up the phone because our loved ones have already passed on, or for one reason or another, our families simply do not know the information that we seek. In Italian American families, many times the older generation, our grandparents and great-grandparents, were reluctant to speak about their history and experiences, especially the generation that immigrated prior to World War II. The old country was oftentimes what they left behind, and there were sometimes painful or uncomfortable memories attached to it. Being an Italian immigrant wasn't always fashionable. In many cases, it was looked down upon or scorned. Exploring this family history is a pleasure that's afforded to subsequent generations of subsequent generations who are oftentimes in much better socioeconomic place than their forebears. The idea of going back and discovering our past reflects our place in history. If you are one of the many people who perhaps whose families did not provide details about their immigration journey or their early years in the United States, have no fear. There's still quite a bit that can be discovered, and we're going to be moving on to that in just a second. Next, we're going to suggest that you begin by examining what you have. Chances are there's a box in your home or maybe in the home of a loved one that contains old photographs, documents, and personal effects of family members. Looking on the back of photographs for names, and if the elders of your family are still living, asking them to help identify the people in the photographs is a great start. You might also find a treasure trove of letters or other documents containing information about your ancestors. The envelopes themselves are sometimes likely to have mailing addresses and date stamps that can help you assemble your family history timeline. After completing your this preliminary phase of research, you can start searching external resources. In this section, we'll be discussing some of the free databases available, that is, those who do not require a subscription in order to access. And let's see. Moving on to that. The Family History Center at Ellis Island, this website allows you to search approximately 65 million passenger records from the 1890s to the early 1950s. You'll find maybe the name of the ship that your ancestor took to the United States, who he or she was traveling with, and other neat facts. We'll be discussing how to interpret ship manifests and other arrival documents in just a few minutes, so stay tuned. It's also important to remember that not every immigrant entered the United States via Ellis Island. Some came through Boston, Baltimore, Philadelphia. Many Sicilians came through the port of New Orleans. Other immigrants entered through Canada. So if you don't find your ancestor here, don't fret. There are many other places to look. Another useful site is Family Search. Family Search can be described as a free version of Ancestry.com. You can browse records, images, genealogies, and other resources after creating a free account. You'll notice we included the websites of these databases at the bottom of the screen in the blue box. And let's see. Alrighty, moving on. So the Library of Congress has a searchable database of historic United States newspapers, a collection that spans from 1789 to 1963. The more recent newspapers can be found elsewhere. In this database, you'll find newspapers from all over the country, from small mining towns to big cities. There are papers in a number of foreign languages in addition to English. This database can be narrowed by region. So if you know that your great-grandfather settled in Pennsylvania, you can search for his name in papers published only in that state. What are you likely to find? Well, certainly if your relative did something newsworthy or noteworthy, you might find a record of it. This could be something as simple as attending a parade or making a donation to support victims of a natural disaster. Many times the papers will have what we call society pages. You can think of them as the original social media. And these pages record events such as engagements and birth announcements, and even trivial events, people visiting friends and relatives in other cities, or even if your ancestor was the guest in the home of another person for dinner. Oftentimes, these historic newspapers, you'll find things like obituaries, which can provide great information, including your loved one's address at the time of his or her demise, where he or she was, or where he or she was buried, or is buried, I should say. And if your relative was a member of a group such as the Mutual Benefit Society, that might have assisted in one way or another with the burial. Obituaries can also provide clues about other family members. If you have been unable to find your great-grandmother's death record, for instance, your great-grandfather's obituary might read something like, Rocco was preceded in death by his wife, Ava. If Rocco died in 1930, and you know that your great-grandmother was present at her daughter's wedding in 1920, you can deduce that she therefore died sometime between 1920 and 1930. And being able to kind of narrow your field in this way will help you in your more advanced research. So moving on, kind of on the same topic, Find a Grave and A Billion Graves are free websites that enable you to discover the resting places of individuals in the United States and elsewhere in the world. It's far from comprehensive, obviously, but these sites are ever growing. You're also able to contribute to the site. You can upload a person's name, their date of birth, date of death, a short biography, and an image of them or their grave marker. It's kind of a Wikipedia for graves, if you will. Last, but certainly not least of the free websites is the National Archives. So if we can advance to that slide. The National Archives is a wonderful tool for researching your family's history. And much of the information contained on the site provides, is information that subscription-based websites such as Ancestry.com charge to access. You'll be able to search census records, military service records, and immigration and naturalization records, among other documents. We're going to be discussing how to interpret these documents in greater detail in the next part of this presentation. So moving on now to paid databases. The first, the largest is, and probably one that most people are familiar with, is of course Ancestry.com. If you don't want to pay for a subscription to Ancestry or some of these other paid databases, oftentimes your public library will offer access to those sites. Like the National Archives, Ancestry offers access to census, military, immigration, and naturalization records, among other records. You might also on Ancestry find the 1903 city directory in which your ancestor is listed, or your grandmother's high school yearbook. Ancestry is also one of the largest consumer DNA networks. It enables you to build a family tree and identify possible ancestors based on the family trees of other site users. Now, whether you use Ancestry or the National Archives to source these historic records, let's talk a little bit about the how to interpret these documents and the information that they provide. We'll start where it often began for your relatives, that fateful trip over on the boat. We're going to be examining a few different ship manifests or passenger arrival lists and discuss how to interpret them, the information that they provide, and some of the notations that you might see on them. Now, let's see. Bear with me just a moment. Alrighty, so early ship manifests, like those from the 1800s, contained a lot less information than later ship manifests. Often, simply they recorded simply the immigrants' names, ages, date of birth, or excuse me, place of origin, and very little information other than that. As the United States government began playing a more active role in immigration and sought to limit the immigrants from certain countries, including Italy, and bar immigrants with certain traits or health issues, and limit the spread of infectious diseases, the amount of information recorded on the manifests became much more detailed. Here is an 1890s manifest. You'll see it notes the immigrant's name, age, gender, occupation, their hometown, the destination where they're headed in the United States, but very little else. Now, on this 1912 manifest, for immigrants entering the United States via Ellis Island, you'll notice on the top left, right where the red circle is, thank you, you'll see the name of the ship, the Oceana, which set sail from the port of Palermo on 3/14/1912, or March 14th, 1912, and arrived at the port of New York on March 29th, 1912, roughly 15 days later. Locating your ancestor on a manifest can be very exciting, and a quick search is also likely to produce an image of the ship on which they made their fateful voyage. So right here is the Oceana, which you saw in the previous document. Let's take a look at this manifest in greater detail. So on the far left, you'll see the immigrant's last name, then their first name, their age, in both years and months, their gender, their marital status, occupation, whether they were able to read and write, and their nationality and race. You'll notice, interestingly, that at this time, immigrants from Southern Italy were seen as a different race or people from their Northern Italian counterparts. Moving on, you'll see the province in Italy and the town where the immigrant hailed. The names of their next of kin in that town, and the destination where the immigrant was headed in the United States. These last three pieces of information can really help you build your family tree, as often the immigrants identified a parent or sibling in their hometown or in the place where they were headed. It can also tell you where to focus your future research. If your ancestor was headed to Philadelphia, for instance, that's a good place to continue the search. You'll also see who paid your ancestor's passage. how much money they were in possession of when they arrived. You'll see number 4, passenger number 4 on this ship manifest brought with him $23. The manifests also note whether the immigrant had previously been in the United States, the name and address of the relative that they plan on joining in the United States, whether the person has ever been in prison, whether they were ever a resident of an almshouse or a facility that cared for the poor, whether the immigrant identifies as a polygamist or anarchist, whether they were part of a labor contract, and their physical and mental health, whether they have a physical disability, as well as the immigrant's height, complexion, hair, and eye color, as well as any other identifying marks such as a scar or a birthmark, and their place of birth. Sometimes this information can reveal the origins of that mysterious recessive gene in your family. Another interesting thing to note on this manifest, if you notice the lines highlighted, or excuse me, if you notice at the top of the manifest, there's some lines that are crossed out. These are the names of people who, for one reason or another, did not board the ship, maybe because of an illness or a delayed delayed sailing date. These people can also be individuals who did in fact board the ship, but who did not get off, typically because they continued to another port, or in some instances, they died during the voyage. Usually though, it was because the passenger did not board the ship, or they continued on to another port. You'll also notice on this document that there are some names highlighted in blue. This woman who was traveling with her children, although she was married, she traveled under her maiden name. It was not uncommon for Italian women to do that. Again, although she was a married woman, she was traveling under her maiden name, and you notice that her children's names are surnames are different from hers. So if you can't find a female relative traveling under their married name, you might also search under their maiden name. While you'll notice quite a few notations on these manifests, one thing that you do not see are immigrants' names being changed or changed to more anglicized names. That's because, contrary to popular belief, this really did not happen at Ellis Island or other ports of entry for that matter. Many people say, oh, well, my relative's name was changed at Ellis Island. Typically that was not the case. And we'll explain why. So the immigrants' tickets were purchased and the ship manifests were prepared in the immigrant's homeland, using the information that the immigrant or his or her designee provided. Many immigrants could neither read nor write, and transcription errors or mistakes on the way that their names were recorded were often a result of this. For instance, if your family's name was Mortillaro and they were not literate, it could have been spelled the way that they pronounced it or the way that the person transcribing the name heard it. Martellaro, Mortillaro, Martellaro sounds similar. And so that error might have taken place prior to them even boarding the ship to come to the United States. Sometimes these errors occurred during the process of transliterating a name from one alphabet to another. For instance, Cyrillic, the alphabet that Russian is written in, or Hebrew, to the Latin alphabet, which we write the English language in. The name, for instance, the surname Sislin, would have typically been spelled with a Z, or that's at least one way to spell it. But because in English there's fewer names or fewer words that contain the letter Z, it might have been transcribed as Sislin with a leading S. Immigrants, or I should say, the immigration officials in the United States verified the information that the immigrant provided, comparing it against the manifest. Which again, the manifests were prepared in the immigrants' homelands. Immigration officials were not in the business of arbitrarily changing immigrants' names to something more American sounding. This again is one of the most common myths. For the same reasons that we would not want to change a person's identity today, immigration officials of yesteryear wanted a record of who was coming into the country, how to locate them and their next of kin if necessary. So if your great aunt Annunziata was known as Nancy in the United States, typically that took place, that was a change that occurred in the United States. Or if your family's surname was originally Dana or Gioia, which means joy in Italian, and if they became the Dana family or the Joy family, these changes took place after their immigration, after they settled in this country. Immigrants, back then especially, wanted to be less conspicuous. They wanted to often appear more American, or they grew tired of always having to spell their names or correct people in their pronunciation. So another interesting piece of information that you can glean from ship manifests is how frequently immigrants left their native villages in the company of family and kin from their hometowns. The column to which the red arrow is pointing notes the names of towns from which the immigrants hailed. And the quotation marks, or the ditto marks that follow, indicate that all the people on the subsequent lines came from that same town or that same place. You'll notice that every passenger on this manifest is traveling with at least one other person from their same town, and in many cases, several. So this was, again, typically the case. Many of us are aware of the stories of immigrants making the, if we could back up one slide, I just skipped over a piece of information. So later ship manifests, such as this one from 1920, can be a little bit easier to read because they were typewritten. They weren't, transcribed in that beautiful, ornate cursive that can be really challenging to decipher. You'll notice that the immigration officer adjusted the amount of money that the immigrant reported having in his or possession when they disembarked. So they compare that number to what the immigrant purported or reported having when they first boarded the ship to what they actually had in their possession when they disembarked. Okay, so moving on, thank you. Many of us are aware of the stories of immigrants making that grueling 2-week voyage, traveling steerage class, only to be deemed unfit for entry to the United States, and informed that he or she or a loved one that they were traveling with would be sent back to their homeland. Now, this did occur. Medical officers examined thousands of immigrants quickly. Their job was, if you can imagine, a ship arriving with, thousands of immigrants, and at times, these ships arriving frequently with large numbers of passengers. The medical officer or examiner's job was to keep the line moving, So if they had any suspicion as to whether the person might be carrying an infectious disease or have some other trait that would deem them unfit for entry to the United States, they would, basically take them aside. So immigrants diagnosed with infectious diseases such as tuberculosis, venereal diseases, a trachoma, they were prohibited from entering the United States, along with those who had conditions such as epilepsy. Officers would typically mark the immigrants' clothing with chalk to indicate what the immigrants' suspected disease or defect was. So the letters EX, for instance, indicated that the individual should be examined further, while the letter C indicated an eye condition, S would indicate senility, and X, insanity, or some other type of psychological condition that they suspected the immigrant having. As you're searching for your ancestors' arrival records, you may stumble upon an inspection record like this. If your ancestor was suspected of having a condition that would make them unfit for entry or admission to the United States, he or she, as I mentioned, would be pulled aside for a more thorough inspection. The most common reason for an immigrant to be singled out for a secondary inspection that could potentially lead to their deportation was the belief that the immigrant would become a financial burden to the United States. Typically, again, it was a medical or a psychological condition that led the inspectors to labeling the immigrant LPC on the manifest or the inspection record. LPC stood for likely public charge. Now, this did not always lead to the immigrant being sent back home, but at a minimum, he or she would undergo further inspection and questioning and may have to provide some kind of assurance from a family member or a friend currently in the United States that would basically say, this person has my support or will be receiving additional support from me. I will be responsible for this person. Some of the other historical documents that you're likely to uncover include city directories, which those of us of certain generations came to know or long referred to as the white pages. City directories list your ancestor's address, many times their place of work or occupation, and if applicable, the name of their spouse. But they can also help you assemble your family history timeline. For instance, you may be unsure as to when your grandfather died. You know that he was living when your father was born in 1920, but that he had already died by 1930. This city directory is from 1927. And you'll notice that if a woman was a widow, this was noted in the directory. Here you see Annunziata Ardese, Annunziata, who has not yet become Nancy, who's recorded as the widow of Angelo. You could therefore deduce that your grandfather, who you knew was living in 1920, had already passed away by 1927 because his wife, again, Annunziata, is listed as a widow. If you search other directories, you could perhaps narrow his date of death even further. Now, moving on, census records. The federal census is a fantastic resource for constructing your family history. The federal census is conducted every 10 years. We, of course, until just a few days ago, were in the middle of the 2020 census. And in addition to the federal census, Many states have historically conducted state censuses at the 5-year mark between the federal censuses. So much of the information on census documents is fixed. You'll see the state, the county, the town, of where these records were being collected, the street address. You'll see that information I just mentioned at the very top. You see the state of Ohio, the county of Cook, and then on the very far left, you see a portion of the street visible. Of course, if you see this document in its entirety, you'd be able to see the entire street. The names of family members beginning with the head of the household is listed. Typically, the head of the household comes first. If he or she has a spouse, that person's name follows, and then the names of their children or other residents of the home, typically in chronological order, beginning with the oldest member to the youngest. You'll see the person's recorded race, their gender, their age or year of birth, their marital status, the country in which they were born, and the country in which the person's parents were born. Which is, information that I find very, useful and helpful. You'll see a person's year of immigration to the United States and whether he or she has become a naturalized citizen. So if the person has not yet become a naturalized citizen, they're usually noted with the designation AL, which refers to alien. And A refers to naturalized. So that person, had already become a naturalized citizen. Sometimes you'll also see the notation FP, which stands for first papers, meaning that person already submitted their first series of papers or documents to petition to become a naturalized citizen of the United States. You'll also see whether the person attended school and for how long, their occupation, whether the person is able to read and write, whether they own the home in which they live. On this 1900 census, which you also see in 1910, or on the 1910 census, you'll notice that the women on the form were asked how many children they have given birth to. And of that number, how many are still living, which is, a very personal piece of information. But it gives you, it can give you just a tremendous amount of insight, if this is, of course, a relative. How many children did your grandmother have? What was the infant mortality rate at that time? How did the infant mortality rate of your family compare to other families? To me, it's really just a fascinating and often very humbling piece of information. By looking at the other surnames and places of birth on the form and the pages that precede it and follow it, you can get a sense of the neighborhood in which your ancestor lived. Did they reside in a place where they were kind of the minority, ethnic, religious, or otherwise? Were they, we'll go backwards just a second. We will move on just a moment. I'm sorry, I'm staying quite a while on this slide. You can see, how did their income, compare? Was their neighborhood comprised mostly of renters, or did most people own their home? You can look at the occupations of their neighbors. So it's a very, census documents provide tremendous insight. And if you spend some time studying them and familiarizing yourself with them, there's just quite a bit of information that can be gleaned. Okay, now moving on. So as I mentioned previously, the questions that each census asks will often differ, or they differed by the decade. The census for 1930, for instance, which we're looking at right now, asks some interesting questions, such as whether the household owned a radio. Not everybody could afford a radio in 1930. Finding your ancestor's name misspelled on the census is actually quite common. That was one of the questions that we received. Census takers were not necessarily proficient in any of the various languages of the people that they were charged with recording. And if your ancestor's English was limited, or whether, or if he or she was not fully literate, maybe unable to express how to spell their name, mistakes sometimes occurred. So moving on to the 1940 census, going back to kind of the idea that census questions differ by decade, the 1940 census had a number of questions pertaining to work. How many days the person worked that year, whether they were seeking work, whether they were employed by an emergency work agency, or whether they were employed, in emergency work for an agency such as the WPA, one of the New Deal era agencies that were created to lift the nation out of the Depression. So of course, why so many questions about work? Well, even in 1940, the United States was still in the middle of, a horrible economic depression. And, gathering this information, by gathering this information, the federal government was trying to get a better sense of where its citizens were and just how many people were participating in such programs. Okay, so another document or type of document that you might find on websites such as Ancestry and some of the other National Archives, some of the other free databases that we discussed, are your ancestors' draft registration cards. This is a draft registration card from World War I. In a moment, we're going to discuss some other documents and how to interpret them. But let's spend just a couple more minutes here. So during World War I, men between the ages of 18 and 45 were required to register for the draft. Locating your ancestors' draft registration card can provide a wealth of information, from their exact date of birth or what they use as their date of birth, to the place where they were born, their occupation, their address, citizenship status, their dependents, their height, their hair color, and their next of kin. So one of the ways in which the draft registration cards are so valuable is that neither the ship manifest nor census forms contain your ancestors' exact date of birth. That's a piece of information that the draft registration cards do provide. And many times your relative, depending on how many years back we're talking, might not have necessarily known their exact date of birth, or what was recorded on even the documents in their native, in their homelands, wasn't always accurate. But at least here on these draft registration cards, you can see the date of birth that your ancestor used and what you may or may not find in other documents that we're going to be discussing in just a moment. So moving on to the World War II era, what's kind of neat about these documents also is that they were completed by your ancestor himself, sometimes with another person's assistance, but your ancestor's signature appears on this document You'll notice that this World War II draft registration card is for a man named Antonio Campanaro, who worked at Hal Roach Studios in Los Angeles. Hal Roach, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the name, is remembered for series such as Laurel and Hardy and Our Gang, also known as The Little Rascals. And Antonio Campanaro was his animal trainer. Okay, so moving on to naturalization records. Petitions to become a naturalized citizen are other documents on which you're able to see your ancestors' personalized imprints. The content of United States naturalization records varies depending on the time period, also depending on the court in which they filed that petition. Records from 1906 onward contain the immigrant's name, their marital status, the name of their spouse and children, the birth dates for their spouse and children, their port of arrival, date of arrival, the name of the vessel or boat on which they travel to the United States, the person's occupation, physical description, the date on which they were married, their age, where they were living at the time of applying for citizenship, their last foreign address, and your ancestor's signature. They often usually contain the name of a witness who was typically a close friend or a relative. So finding your ancestor's naturalization form can, again, provide so much information that will really help you connect some dots and fill in that timeline and know where to direct your future research. So moving on to marriage records, another document that you might come across is a record of your ancestor's marriage. Depending on where your ancestor lived and when the wedding took place, that marriage record may look like this one from 1914. This is, of course, handwritten and is from the city of Detroit. Or it could look like this one from 1949 in Los Angeles. Clearly lots more people and fine print, but basically on this record, you'll see the name of the bride, the name of the groom, the age of each, and the date of the marriage. Sometimes you can also find divorce records. Okay, so if you're able to narrow down where your family first settled in the United States, and you suspect that your family was associated with a church or other house of worship, it's also possible to locate that parish or that house of worship, that diocese, or the equivalent, and request sacramental records. Baptismal records, such as the one you see here from 1907, contain the parents' full names, including the mother's maiden name, which can kind of help you fill in that gap, as well as the names of the child's godparents and the name of the priest who performed the ceremony. So sacramental records are typically organized by year. So if you know that your relative was born in 1907, typically he or she would be baptized that same year or the following year. Again, that's just typical. There might have been a lot of reasons why that wasn't necessarily the case for your family. If you find out based on the naturalization record or another document, the year in which your ancestors were married, you could contact the church or the house of worship and see if they're able to find, look through the records for that year and track down your ancestors. sometimes, in the case that a parish, a church is no longer active, oftentimes those records, at least in the Catholic Church, were transferred to the next closest church or parish. Okay, now that we've spoken quite a bit about decoding historic documents, we're going to discuss how to avoid making some of the most common mistakes that novice researchers make. And I'm going to take a drink of water before we do that. Okay, first, one of the questions you have to ask yourself is the person in this record really your ancestor, or is the record leading you astray? Now, what I mean by that is, when you do genealogical research, historic research, it's very exciting. You find the name of a person who's, similar to that of your ancestor, or even the same name as your ancestor. It's important to evaluate, is this person really related to me? To give you an idea, earlier this month, the IAMLA was doing research for a family who was seeking information about an ancestor about which they knew very little. We basically had a name and an approximate date of birth and some other unconfirmed information. At first, it seemed that the person's relative had in fact married and was the father, or had been the father of 2 children, which would suggest that this relative has some living descendants to be tracked down somewhere out there. But after searching more, we discovered that there were in fact 2 men living in the same town with the same name and similar birth years who were not related. One man, this person's relative, had actually died in 1922 at the age of 20. He had never married and did not have any children. The second person, who again was not a relation, lived well into his 60s and of course had grandchildren and probably other living descendants. We were able to locate the death record for this family's relative and provide insight as to why he died so young. Moral of the story, it's important to be thorough in your research in order to avoid marrying off your great-grandfather to a woman he never knew, and to avoid taking your research into directions that will eventually produce kind of some disappointing results or dead ends. Okay, so next, be aware of common names. While many of us are aware of what have long been common so-called American names, John Smith, Mary Fisher, we're less familiar with the common surnames of other ethnic groups, including our own. Although they may sound unique to our ears, Italian surnames such as Marino, Russo, Gallo, Costa, Giordano, Lombardi, Mancini, Ricci, the list goes on and on. These are some of the most common surnames in Italy. If your grandfather's name was Giuseppe Marino, that's one of those mistakes that could have been made at Ellis Island. Giuseppe Marino, or your grandmother was, for instance, Maria Russo, chances are you will find hundreds of individuals with that name. And that's after you've narrowed it down by birth year. Referring to the document that we mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, that list of facts helps avoid making some of these mistakes. For instance, if you find over 200 people named Giovanni Giordano living in New York City in 1905, and of those Giovanni Giordanos, 30 of them might have been born around 1888 in Italy, the year that you suspect your Ancestor was born. And of those, all of them arrived, all but, maybe 10 arrived in the United States in 1907. These are just examples, of course, the year that your ancestor arrived. So, you find these things. So there's 200 Giovanni Giordano's, 30 of them were born in 1888. And 15 of them arrived in the United States in 1907, the same year that your ancestor arrived. Now, you're looking at census records for these 15 different Giovanni Giordanos. How do you know which one is your ancestor? Well, remember the document we were talking about. Maybe you learned, maybe one of your family members told you that your grandfather, your great-grandfather, had a sister named Serafina. As you're looking at those census documents from 1910 and you find a Giovanni Giordano living with a woman, a relative, somebody who's identified as a sibling by the name of Serafina, it's much more likely that you found your match, and you can at least continue your due diligence researching this particular Giovanni Giordano and spending less time on the others. Again, a lot of historical research is following hunches, is exploring, investigating leads until you either rule out the information as incorrect, or you determine that the information is indeed true, and this person is the individual that you're looking for. Now, other common mistakes to avoid. Where you think you are from may not actually be where your family is from. Now, this may sound very strange, but we actually encounter it quite a bit. Many Italian immigrants, many immigrants, from Europe as a whole, came from small rural towns. And when asked where they were from, especially, in the United States, of course, they had the tendency of providing the name of the closest, much larger city. So if an immigrant, for example, was from the little town of Cassano Irpino in Campania, they would often say that they were from Naples. Naples, of course, is the largest city in the region of Campania, a place that most everyone is familiar with. It's kind of like if you're traveling elsewhere, if you're traveling abroad and you're from New Rochelle, New York, if somebody asks you where you're from in the United States, you might just say New York or New York City, because people are unlikely to know where New Rochelle is. So kind of going back to the tendency of Italian immigrants stating, providing the name of a much larger city or the next much larger city. That city, especially Naples, was often where that immigrant, your ancestor, departed from. So, your ancestor might have departed from the port of Naples. That might appear on some of the documents you find, but the little town where he or she was actually from could have been quite a distance from Naples itself. And as generations passed, the notion that the family actually originated in Naples kind of becomes cemented into the family's history. It becomes its adopted history, so to speak. Another example, last year, a family contacted the IAMLA to help find where their family was from. The family had long believed that they came from Reggio di Calabria. That's what family members had always said. The province and the city of Reggio di Calabria is located in the region of Calabria, which is the toe of Italy's boot. Reggio di Calabria is a very tip of the boot, right at the toe. It's just across from the Strait of Messina, the little waterway that separates the mainland of Italy from Sicily. Now, the family had actually traveled to Reggio di Calabria, which is a fairly large city of about 200,000 people. They looked up their name in the phone book, and they could not find a single person that had their same surname. And of course, they came back home rather disappointed. Through our research, we discovered that the family is not from Reggio di Calabria. They're actually from a tiny hilltop town of about 500 inhabitants, 2.5 hours by car from Reggio di Calabria. The family's town of 500 in the hills of Calabria has about as much in common with the city of Reggio di Calabria as, again, New York City and Yonkers have in common. They're in the same state or region. They're both close to the water, but there aren't very many similarities beyond that. So since finding out the truth about their family's origins, this family has actually made contact with some distant relatives in their real hometown, and they have plans to meet them after the pandemic is history. So again, where you think you're from may not always be where you're actually from. And I say that because while you're reviewing these historic documents, you know, if your family has long said, oh, we're from Naples, we're from Rome, and you find a little city that you've never heard of before, a little town or village that you know, with a name you've never come across, be open to at least kind of exploring that clue more. I mean, clearly, if where, you know, where what you find on these documents is somewhere completely different, then it may not be a lead worth pursuing. But if you know, find the name of a little town outside of Naples, that might be your clue that you want to examine a little bit more. Okay, so another thing to be aware of, be aware of changing borders and place names. Throughout Italy and elsewhere in the world, the names of towns and regions have changed. In some cases, the place where your ancestor was born may be an entirely different country today than it was at the time of their birth. In Italy, many towns were renamed at the time of Italian unification. Others were renamed during World War I or World War II. If your ancestor was born in Trento, in what is now northern Italy, prior to the year 1919, his or her birthplace is likely to read Austria or Austria-Hungary on official documents. The region of Basilicata in southern Italy, for example, was known as Lucania during Mussolini's time. A member of one family whose history we were researching had 3 different birthplaces on his grandfather's documents. So, you know, although it was all the same person, although all these documents were indeed connected to this man's grandfather, one document listed Russia, another document listed Poland, and then yet another document listed Lithuania as the relative's birthplace during, you know, various years. So they were all correct because the area where he was born was governed or became one of those countries during various times in its history and during this man's lifespan. Even in the United States, you may find relatives who were born in towns that no longer exist. It might have been a robust mining town at the time of your ancestor's birth. Now it's a ghost town. Now it may not even be on a map anymore. And you find this a lot in Eastern Europe, especially. So encountering this information can easily throw a person off. but you might want to take a moment to learn a little bit about historical geography and dig a little bit deeper if you encounter the name of a town that's unfamiliar. All right, so now continuing your search. Now that you've, hopefully armed yourself with this, with some fantastic information, now that you've researched your family's origins and uncovered quite a bit of material about their lives, their early years, their arrival to the United States, there's some new doors that will undoubtedly, I should say, undoubtedly open for you. Sometimes you can find, for instance, an online message board for your village, or an online message board for your village, in which descendants of the townspeople in various parts of the world exchange information. Once you've identified your ancestors' towns in Italy, it's possible to also reach out to the comune or the town hall to request birth records, which are again organized by year. There's an example of what those birth records look like. Again, the older records were of course all handwritten, and they go into tremendous detail, noting the witnesses to the birth, the father's, the child's father's age and occupation. Again, these birth records are organized by year. So if you've determined that your great-grandfather was born in 1879, you would contact the comune and say, my grandfather's name was such and such, he was born in 1879. In many cases, once you've found this, one birth record or two birth records, you can continue tracing your ancestors back in that town based on those records. Because of course, not only your grandfather's parents are mentioned on these records, but using those names, you can go back further to their parents and so on and so forth. Southern Italy in particular was excellent at maintaining just painstakingly detailed records of their citizens. Some of them even did censuses that contain just a wealth of information about the value of women's dowries at the time of their marriage, or the possessions of what each family possessed in terms of financial assets. It might be land, trees, animals, that sort of thing. So there's quite a bit that you might be able to find in your native village as well. You can also contact the local parish of your ancestors' village to obtain copies of sacramental records. The website parochie.it, and that's spelled PARROCCHIE.IT. And I apologize, we didn't put this information on the screen, can serve as a valuable tool for tracking down Italian sacramental records. These would be for active parishes only, however. And again, just as in the United States, the records of inactive parishes were often transferred to another local parish or diocese. There's a good chance that in your ancestral village, there's a good chance that your ancestral village has its own Facebook page. And that can be quite a bit of fun. If you do a search of your town on social media, you'll often find that page, and the members of that group or people who follow that page are likely to have surnames that are, the same as yours, or those of other family members. So that's also a good start. Don't hesitate to reach out to members of this group. Introduce yourself and inquire about information about your family. Almost every Italian town, no matter how small, has the person who's kind of identified as the de facto historian, the person who knows the history of the town. And oftentimes this person is willing to assist you in conducting genealogical research. So give it a go. You'll never know what you might find. Ideally, this quest to discover your family history will result in a trip to the places where your family is actually from. Visiting one's ancestral village is a transformative experience. There's nothing quite like walking along the same streets where generations of your family did for centuries, seeing the homes that your family members built. Although 75% of Italian Americans hail from Italy's south, from the Mezzogiorno, when Italian Americans visit Italy, they typically spend time in places like Venice, Florence, Rome, all of which are wonderful. You know, you definitely want to visit them. They're incredible places. But Southern Italy is a completely different land. Traveling to Italy without seeing, traveling to Italy and only seeing the major tourist destinations would be like growing up in Boise, Idaho, and taking your son or daughter to Chicago to learn about where they were raised. Same country, very different culture, very different history. Make that trip to your village. You'll probably find the warmest people, people who welcome you with open arms. And, and if you've connected with them on Facebook prior to scheduling that trip, you're likely to have all the better of an experience. We are going to be opening it up to questions in a couple minutes. Now, if you're interested in learning more, or connecting with a professional, or if you enjoyed and would like to support future programs like this, please visit our website. You can consider becoming a member. You can also send us an email if you have any questions or would like more information about researching your family's genealogy. We also encourage you to follow the Italian American Museum of Los Angeles on Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you don't miss out on any of the fantastic future content that we are in the process of creating for you. So now opening it up to questions. Let's see, let's see if we can get our first question going. Okay, so some of these, as I mentioned before, were shared with us previously, and we're going to try to answer as many of them as possible. Let's see, again, we tried to incorporate as many answers as we could into the webinar itself, but some of the more specific questions we waited towards the end. Alrighty, so let's see, our first question. My grandmother was born in 1898, and from what I can tell, the family arrived in 1899. On some documents, it states that she was born in Italy, while others state that she was born in the United States. Which is likely to be more accurate? Well, I would wager, I would kind of counsel you that if you found a document that states your grandmother was born in 1898 and that she and you find an arrival record that shows your family, your ancestors arriving the following year, she's most likely to have been born in Italy, and obviously arrived as an infant. It wasn't uncommon for people like your grandmother who arrived when they were very young to kind of phase out their foreign birth during their lifetime. It was, again, kind of behooved them to be a citizen of the United States. And at that time, there was not as great of a paper trail as, say, there is now, with the assignment of social security numbers right after a child was born. And we live in a completely different time than 120 years ago. So I would say that your grandmother was most likely to have been born in Italy. And what you might want to do is see if the comune, if the town where the family was from, has any record of her birth taking place in 1898. And that will also help kind of, help you determine which one was correct. All right, moving on to question number 2. Let's see. I have been unable to find my grandfather's arrival record. I've found other family members, but not his. Why is this? Okay, so we actually received kind of 2 very similar questions. So the next question is, I have never been able to find my grandparents' names on a ship manifest. Why is this? Okay, so there are a number of different reasons why you may not have been able to locate the ship manifests for your ancestors. Sometimes the records are so deteriorated that digitizing them, or better yet, deciphering the digitized records, is nearly impossible. It may be that your family's names were not transcribed correctly when they were digitized, when that digitized record was created, or that for whatever reason, their particular record is not yet accessible online. What I would suggest you do is, you either can hire a professional, try some alternative spellings. As we mentioned earlier, try, if it was a female relative, try her maiden name. But you also might want to keep checking back, because many times, these records are either updated, new records are added, or some of these records that were previously digitized, and the digitized transcription might not have been the best, have actually been improved. And so you can find records that weren't there, a couple years ago or even a few months ago. So that's my suggestion. Alrighty, another question we received. In fact, we received quite a few questions about tracking down ancestry records in Italy, including records pertaining to orphan children. I'm going to try to address or answer those questions all in one response. So bear with me. As we covered in earlier in the presentation, if you know the name of the town, or the town, the village, the city, and the birth year, you can try contacting the comune of the town hall, the Hall of Records, to inquire about your ancestor. Many of these comune have email addresses that you can use, and you can basically share the information about your ancestor and what you're trying to locate. Regarding orphans, I'm just going to select one of the questions that we received, because again, I think that the answer will apply to both. Okay, so I have a question about my great-great-grandfather, Carlo, and I'm going to omit the last name because I'm not sure if you wanted us to share that. He left Vaglio Basilicata in the Potenza province and came to America. My great-great-grandfather, Carlo, was an orphan. The only information we have on his birth is that what was recorded on his marriage record from 1877 in Italy. His marriage record lists Napoli or Naples as his birthplace, but there's no information about his parents. How do we find orphan records? So how do we find orphan or adoption records? So, my friend, your great-great-grandfather, Carlo, or, this applies to the other questions we received as well, was likely what was referred to as a foundling or an abandoned newborn. The surname that you provided, which again, I won't mention out of respect for your privacy, is most likely that of his adopted family, not his original surname. You can find abandoned Italian children or orphans in Italian civil records, but the names of their parents are seldom identified. On his birth record or his marriage record or his military record, Carlo's parents are likely to have been listed as parenti ignoti, or unknown parents, or there might just have been like a little scratch on the line to indicate that the names of his parents and even his place of birth perhaps, or other information was unknown or is unknown. Children like your great-great-grandfather were often abandoned because their parents were too poor to care for them, or because the child was conceived out of wedlock. And at the time, social and political policies made it difficult for a pregnant and unmarried woman to keep and raise her child. It brought shame to her and her family. That's often why, the names of the parents were not revealed. After your great-grandfather's birth, he was likely taken to the hospicio, or the hospice, a hospital or a church, or the home of a midwife, where he was left. And interestingly enough, at that time, there were actually devices in Italy and elsewhere in Europe known as foundling wheels, which were basically wooden cylindrical boxes that were installed on the outer wall of a church or a hospital or another place in town, where the unwanted newborn could be placed. So the baby was placed inside the wheel, and then the wheel was turned, at which point the baby was left inside the building, basically surrendered anonymously. This system is not unlike the safe surrender system that many municipalities have adopted in recent years. The hospital or church would then assign a name to the child, and abandoned or orphaned children were often given surnames such as Esposito, which means exposed or abandoned, Innocenti, which is innocent one, Della Casa Grande, which means, from the hospicio, from the hospital, or Trovato, which means found. And it was these surnames that were then recorded in the town's register. Some towns recorded, so kind of getting back to your question here, how to find the records, some towns recorded the births within the regular birth registers of the town, whereas other towns separated the abandoned or orphaned and recorded them in a supplemental register. These were sometimes referred to as allegati. It was common for a detailed description of the baby to be included in that birth register. His or her approximate age at the time that they were found, the type of clothing that he or she was found in, if there were any belongings that were left with the child. And the reason that this information was recorded so meticulously was because if the mother ever came back to claim her child, she would describe the clothing, the personal effects that the child was left with in order to prove that the child was hers. Now, many children were, never reclaimed. And oftentimes the child was not born in the place where they grew up or lived in as adults. So this sounds like it was the situation for your great-great-grandfather. He was born in Naples, and he was raised in a town in the Potenza province. Abandoned children were often sent to rural areas where they were fostered by local families who were paid stipends by the state to help provide for their support. Many of these families also utilized the children as apprentices. They trained them in a particular trade, and the adoptions, to continue answering your question, were typically informal. They didn't involve a lot of paperwork. So, in short, to continue answering your question, you could start by searching through the very old birth records of it sounds like your great-great-grandfather was born in the late 1850s. So if you were able to narrow his birth year, you could search through these records that by that year or two for an abandoned child named Carlo. But you're unlikely to find the names of his birth parents. Unless, of course, he was not adopted for the reasons that we're assuming. You may have better luck actually taking a DNA test and seeing if you can narrow down some relatives based on that. Okay, so the next question we received is, are there any databases you can recommend for people with African American or Native American ancestry? So yes, there are lots of other resources that we didn't specifically cover tonight because this webinar could easily span several hours if we were to, to discuss everything. But if your family is, so there's lots of resources geared specifically to various ethnic groups. So if your family is of Native American ancestry, you might try Access Genealogy, which is very helpful. If your family is of African American heritage, you could also try Afrogenius. Jewish Gen is a great tool if your family is of Jewish ancestry. You could also search genealogical resources and then the name of the ethnic group to see what other resources, databases are out there that I haven't mentioned, and there are many. All right, so the next question we received was, which race were the Italians listed as on ship manifests of the early 1900s? So as we discussed during our program earlier this month, and as you saw on the ship manifest, Italians were categorized as a separate race known or designated as Italian South. So Southern Italians were considered a different race than Northern Italians. All righty. The next question, and I think this is our last question, is Okay, so we've received lots of questions about how to apply for Italian citizenship. This webinar was really designed to help you start to compile the documents that you will need in order to, take that project on, such as, birth records, marriage records, citizenship forms, death certificates, but, specific questions about qualifications for Italian citizenship, paying taxes in Italy, that's beyond the purview of this webinar. We're not experts on the topic. So what we suggest is that for a complete description of the dual citizenship process, who qualifies, and other details, we suggest that you visit the website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Italian government. And that website is www.esteri.it, and that's spelled ESTERI.IT. That's going to be a much better resource that will provide the specific information you're looking for, because there's so many different scenarios and details that you're going to need to be aware of. But again, starting by finding these documents will help determine if you're eligible, and you'll need many of the documents that we discussed tonight to actually set that process into motion. So I think that's all the questions that we have, unless I'm missing something. But again, if you're interested in learning more, we invite you to email us at info@italianhall.org. Visit our website, IAMLA.org, and there's a whole area about genealogical research. Please, share this webinar with your friends. It's going to be available long after the broadcast via the IAMLA's YouTube channel and on our Facebook page. We encourage you to share this information with others. Thanks so much again for tuning in tonight. We encourage you to reach out. We look forward to seeing you again next month for our upcoming program. And again, a very happy Italian American Heritage Month. What better of a way to celebrate your heritage than discovering some of the details about your family's early history and their years in the United States, and above all, preserve that history for future generations. Thanks so much. Have a great evening. Stay safe, everyone. Good night.